Data World Podcast, the independent voice in aerospace, defence and space technical information, covering all the news, reviews, gossip, opinion, software, standards and specifications in the information production and deployment field.
Yo, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's podcast. And those of you who are joining us on YouTube and watching the recording of the podcast, welcome. Those of you who are just listening either via your favorite podcasting piece of software, also welcome. So this is just me doing a very short introduction to this week's podcast, because I've been talking a long time now about I wanted to do some interviews with some of the leading experts in the market and kind of the stuff that they see as the challenges of our market and kind of the stuff that's going on that we need to be aware of. So this week I am interviewing a young man called Peter Stuttard from Aspire Consulting, and we talk about some of the challenges around supportability. So please do enjoy this. It's about an hour and 10 minutes long, so make sure you got yourself a coffee and do enjoy this podcast. So Peter, thank you for being our guest on our first TDW podcast. I appreciate it, and being the guinea pig for something that I hope will be a tremendous success. I know it's something that we've talked about a lot over the last probably 2 years, where we've been working together on doing a podcast. Now, don't know why I went all northern then when I said podcast. Did you hear that? So the now, for those that are listening to the podcast, if you've never met Peter, you don't know who Peter is. Peter's actually been running a second stream to TDW Live, our conference, which is another thing that we were talking about for a long time. How do we bring in the wider supportability aspects to the conference, which has grown year on year now. I think this year's our 9th year of running the conference, so it's doing pretty well. And so I thought what we would do is have a podcast with Peter and talk about support engineering through the eyes of an expert, and who's been doing it since I don't know how long.
Well, Aspire since '96, and as me, I guess I left the army in 1990. So I started in 1990.
So I was just going into my military career at the time. So I guess maybe spend a couple of minutes just giving everybody your background, what brought you into support engineering, why you're so passionate about it, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about TDW Live, and then some of the challenges around support engineering as you see it. So let's start with who you are, what's your background, where you're from, and why Aspire?
Right, so where does it start? My background, ex-REME aviation, same as Mike as it happens.
Yep.
And but I served in the REME for 15 years as an avionics tech. But I served with...
And we won't hold that against you.
Yeah, no, people do. What I've found is that mechanical engineers tend to be good at certain types of things in this sort of business, and electronics people tend, it's not a drum rule, but tend to sort of go into the analytical type stuff.
Yeah, you're very analytical anyway. I've known that about you.
And that kind of fits. But no, I served with 3 Commando for a while, so I like to be able to say basically I was in the army, so land, I was on aeroplanes, so I've done air, and landed with 3 Commando, so I'm maritime, so I've got all 3.
So you're a proper soldier.
So yeah.
So when people ask me, were you in the army? I say, well, I was in the REME. Mm-hmm. You know, so.
No, I don't denigrate it. Cold War warrior, but it's still the real army. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and why Aspire, and where did Aspire come from?
Well, through accidents really, because you leave the army, you've got to find a job. I went to work for one of the major defence contractors, and got into ILS, as it happened. I mean, strangely, my very last task before I left the army, I just escaped from Germany back to the UK just in time to get out of the army. Yep. Thanks to Nick Dodson, who some of you will know, who was my commanding officer back then. I was given a task to look at what would the workshop, 70 aircraft workshop, look like. What would it require to support attack helicopter? Mm-hmm. So that was my last task, and it was all done basically by reading requirements documents and writing on bits of paper and whiteboards, and it was all made up. But it was kind of
made up.
Well, it was all based on wet finger, because you go, well, it's going to have a radar system on, which we hadn't really had on army aircraft before, Army helicopters anyway, apart from IFF or something like that. So you have to have radar techs or something with you, and so on. So it was all based on, it was all logical, but we were guessing how many people we need and how much resources we would require. So that was my final task, and then I left the Army. Obviously you need a job, so I was offered a job by a major defence contractor, and I took that job, and it turned out to be working in ILS. It was actually for BAE Systems down at the Salisbury site, part of the Wharton part.
Salisbury, up by Wharton, yeah.
Yeah,
I did some work at Wharton a long time ago now, but Salisbury, from a Tech Pubs perspective, I remember back then I think they used to do the IPCs and the illustrated parts stuff over there.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's a long time ago now, as you say. And I've slept several times since then, so it's faded away a bit. But anyway, they were doing ILS on one of the first programmes, if not the first programme.
So just for people maybe more in my domain that don't necessarily understand what ILS is, how would you encapsulate it in a couple of statements?
What is it? It's pretty straightforward at the high level. Integrated logistic support. The idea, you can look at it as two things really. One is you've got to look at the totality of the support required to keep a piece of equipment operating. So the REMA used to use the phrase to keep fit equipment in the hand of the user at all times. Well, that's it. That's the point of it. Keep fit equipment in the hands of the user. Now that requires you've got to look at everything. So you've got to look at tech pubs, you look at training, you've got to look at spare parts, how those spares are delivered, how the training is updated, etc. for 20, 30 years of the life of the equipment. And that's got to be done in a coherent way. And anyone who's been in the services will know that you pick up a technical manual sometimes and you walk up to the bit of kit that it's describing and it ain't the same.
Yep.
Or it tells you to do a piece of test kit and the bit of test kit in the stores is not the same. Or the training you get doesn't really, you get overtrained very often, we certainly did in the REME, and you get undertrained in other areas. So the idea is to make sure that everything is coherent and everything is taken into account. And also to take into account the operational environment. We're not training people to fix commercial airliners. We're talking about people who are fixing aeroplanes and tanks and ships theoretically in a combat zone.
Yep.
That's what it's about. So it has to work in a combat zone. Or when you're dealing with insurgents or when you're dealing with a natural disaster. It all has to work in all those different environments. And that's quite challenging. To do that in an optimal way, so you get the greatest possible capability for the minimum possible cost. Because at the end of the day, there's not infinite funds around, as we all know. So that's the idea. That's the output of ILS. Is that coherent, optimised, total support system, if you use the phrasing we use. But of course, the other part of it is then you've got to generate that product. So there's a whole raft of different disciplines involved in delivering all that stuff. And typically they're disparate. They're all done separately. So the guys who do training are in very often a separate site to the guys doing technical publications, for example. That's not right, because you're using the same information, the same data and so on. So the idea is to streamline the process, take out duplication, take out nugatory effort, and to do it, first of all, in the most cost-effective way. So the process is cost-effective, but also, of course, that if you don't have a cost-effective and optimal process, you'll not produce a cost-effective and optimal output. You can't, almost by definition. So you've actually got to look at the way in which you identify support requirements and do that in repeating myself, in an optimal manner, an optimal and cost-effective manner. So that's really what real ILS.
So really, from a tech pubs perspective, we are a small cog in a very large gearbox, if you like, in making this work. So Aspire, you started Aspire to focus on this discipline.
Yeah.
And I guess you've been lucky enough. I know we can't talk specifically about platforms and projects. We shouldn't. But I know that you've supported some very exciting and interesting projects. And so I guess support engineering is a hot topic. It's something that we get asked about a lot when we're talking about tech pubs. So where do we fit? Where should we be getting our information from that we put into our technical publications? And there's lots of areas that we can take content and repurpose it and reuse it and link to within our tech pubs, and we do that as part of our day-to-day working. So, which is why I said to you that I think we need a support track at TDW Live, and I think we said this about 2 years ago, and I know that it's a track that we're trying to grow. Yep. So what do you think in terms of the theme this year for TDW Live from tech pubs? What I want to do, and I know that I've released some videos on this already, is we're taking an old Morris 1100 technical manual, going to convert it through to XML. Notice I'm not mentioning any standards or specifications at this state.
Correct.
And we're talking about how we can then do some sexy stuff with it. How can we then make it into intelligent content? And then have a look at what can we do to take it to the next generation, i.e. what is AR, AI, and how is this all going to affect the way that we write our content and create our content. In fact, recently I was asked by a major aerospace company, we really need to get into AR and we need to get into AI. So that's where I'm going with the technical publications track this year, and that's what I want to achieve, and we've had quite a lot of interest in that. What do you see from the ILS side, from the supportability side?
Well, I see something that kind of complements that. And interestingly, of course, we'll talk about it in detail once we turn the cameras off.
Yeah.
But it basically ties in with the introduction I just made and I explained what ILS was. Our aim is to say, look, what's the end game?
Yeah.
What is the idea at the end of the game? And the argument is for example, taking tech docs. The end game is not tech docs. It's not even a system of delivering tech docs and updating tech docs for 20 years. It's bigger than that. It's actually, ultimately, it's a defence operational capability.
Yep.
And then you start at that point, and that's basically to go and fight wars and do nasty things to the Queen's enemies, and then work backwards. And the argument is stop thinking about disciplines. Don't talk about tech docs. Think actually, what do you need to actually enable, for example, the maintainer to do in the field? Because we know, we're going to put kit in the field, it's going to fail, it's going to get damaged. And we need to react to that. So how do we react to it? Well, one of the things we're going to have to do, and we're stepping backwards all the time now from the end game, one of the things we're going to have to fix it. So you need someone to do the fixing. So how do you enable the person to do the fixing? Now again, I'm very carefully not saying training or tech docs at the minute,
Yep.
but you need to enable that guy to do something and keep stepping backwards from that and work logically. And you said actually quite interesting, I smiled when you said we're just a cog in a big gearbox, because actually in my notes I wrote preparing for our next conversation, I've actually got this thing about a cog in a wheel,
Yeah.
a small cog in a big machine. And the reality is it's a really good analogy because you wouldn't, if you were designing a gearbox, you wouldn't say to one guy, I want you to design that gear. Now disappear off onto the site 3 miles down the road and design that gear for me.
The next guy do the next gear.
And there's somebody else in a different room design
you
another
do
gear.
the casing. Or,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's just too stupid to contemplate. But it's exactly what we do in the world of support. We put people into separate threads. And that's not the right answer. And something else you said there I'll pick up on. You said, well, you take information you've generated, content, and you repurpose it. Now, I get that, but actually when you think about it, there's something gone wrong if you're doing that. Because what you need to do is not use a tech pub and then repurpose it. You need to step back to before it became a tech pub and then say, right, where is this information going? Because it's going to have several roles. So it's you're branching, if you like, into different areas at the wrong point in time. You're too late in the process. So we need to think about that and think about the shared information between tech pubs, training, and all the other things that you do as well. Because if you write a tech pub, you've got to say you need stuff to do the job. You need a list of stuff. Well, someone's got to work out what that stuff is.
Yeah.
And it's got to be optimal. Spares, you've got to optimise spares. So that's
consumables, all this kind of
everything,
stuff.
yeah, exactly. So that's all got to feed into that. And of course, you've also got to look at the bigger picture. You mustn't just look at your bit of kit, because that's not the point. We don't have a support system for Eurofighter. We have a support system which has got Eurofighter specific bits, but most of it is generic for the Royal Air Force, in fact for air. And it's the same with nearly every, and even smaller bits of kit, it's even more so. So if you're talking about land systems in particular, you have even less and less specialised support for land system pieces of equipment. So you've got to look at the bigger picture and say, actually, what's this about? And a really good example is Strike Brigade. Where everyone's talking about Strike Brigade because it falls into the really quite challenging. Take a brigade and go 2,000 kilometres into enemy territory. And while you're doing that, you've got to support it. You've got to keep that kit rolling. So how are you going to do that? How does that affect your training? How does that affect your tech pubs? How does that affect the way you manage your vehicle casualties and your electronics casualties and so on and so forth? So really our idea is to say, look, guys, if you're going to make this work, start at the end and work backwards. And so, for example, one of the things I'm going to do, So I'll tell you, I'll give away the secrets if you like before we do it. One of the things I'm thinking of saying, for example, is if you've done the spares analysis and you've worked out how many spares you require, the ranging and scaling, if you haven't taken into account enemy action, you're wasting your time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because enemy action is going to, first of all, cause damage. Have you thought about damage as opposed to failures? Just failures? The answer is usually no, by the way. And have you thought about the difficulties actually getting those spares forward and getting those repairable items back if you actually send them around a repair loop? Have you taken that into account when you did your sparing analysis? And if you haven't, you're wasting your time.
It's almost like, I call it a what-if analysis. So what if we lost 5 pieces of kit?
And that's
what if we lost 10 soldiers?
Yeah.
What if we lost the satellite?
Yeah, and again, I think that's part of it. Yes, and the satellite's a key one as well. You know, we've got into the habit, and I addressed this on the last seminar as well. Of course, you remember that we've got into the habit of thinking about the last war. You know, we're fighting the last war. If we've got peer-to-peer, and everyone's talking about peer-to-peer warfare now as the potential new threat. If you're fighting the Russians, your comms have been turned off. These guys have got shells they fire from artillery, which are designed to interrupt your comms. They land on the ground and they sit there and interrupt your comms. That's the sort of technology they're using, despite all the big and the normal electronic warfare stuff. So you might not have any comms. You might have a satellite.
Let me give you a real life example of that. Claire and I were in New York recently, and we were in the middle of that blackout zone. I don't know if you saw it on the news.
Pass me by that one.
New York basically had a big blackout, and I've learned it was a software failure.
Yeah, it does.
And there was no communications at all, and the place was in panic.
Yeah.
It was incredible, and you had to, you know, it was all word of mouth because we had no lights, no TVs, no radios, no anything. Cell phones were down, and everyone was in panic. Of course.
We've got to, and this is actually so. The entire military has to take this into account. And of course, there are very bright people looking at this and saying, well, what happens if, and how do we carry on operating? How do we maintain combat effectiveness? Well, we've got to look at that from a support perspective as well. So we have to, we should be looking at support, assuming that the comms are going to get turned off. Or, probably best case is that if there is comms, it's very limited. And the bandwidth available for ordering spare parts and doing all that sort of stuff is going to be limited. It's going to be very, very limited. And you're probably going to be quite a long way down the priority list. There's going to be more important things to do, like, you know, targeting fires and stuff like that.
Sure.
So we should be assuming that these things are going to go. We should be assuming that lines of communication are going to be cut. We should be assuming that we are going to lose a wagon full of spare parts. This is almost, it's not a possibility if you're in a peer-to-peer warfare. It's almost a flying dead cert. And we should still be able to operate under those conditions.
I think wasn't it Op Granby 1 that we were both involved with? I think, wasn't it, they were, and you can correct me because you'll know more than me about this, is that I think when we took the aircraft down to the sandy deserts, they actually didn't realise how bad the sand was going to affect, like, the links. You know, the life cycle of the blades, for example, were dramatically, the main rotor blades were dramatically reduced.
There was a lot of issues like that, from the well-known ones about air filters on Warriors, I think it was, you know, getting blocked and people had to, you know, do something super technical like take them out and bash them on the side of the vehicle. Yes, rotor blades obviously get worn. But again, this is a lack of, from a support perspective, it's very important. What we're not doing is we're not looking at the operational environment when we're looking at our bit of kit. Now, some of you will have heard me go on about this before. A helicopter is a good example. You put a helicopter in the back of a frigate, and there are certain things about being on the back of a frigate it's not going to like. If you put it in the Gulf, it's warm, it's wet, it's salty. So if you've got things made out of aluminium alloy or some shape or form, you're going to have to look after that really quite closely. So structures are going to suffer quite badly in that sort of environment, especially if they're dry jointed structures, for example. However, rotary parts are probably going to be quite reasonably happy with some reasonable precautions. You know, you wash them down occasionally to get the salt off. You know, you keep them lubricated and all that sort of stuff. Rotary parts are going to be happy. Take the same aircraft, and any bit of kit really applies to it. But take the same aircraft, put it into the desert now. And now all of a sudden things change. So all of a sudden now things will go round and round with that really dry. You've got two types. You've got the very fine gritty sand, and you've got this very fine talc powdered sand which gets into everything and packs electronics, because the fans suck cool air in and dust and pack it into the electronics. You've got so basically going round and round wears rotor blades, wear out tremendously fast. Any seals, gearboxes, bearings and so on suffer badly. Structures, however, that aluminium structure, which would suffer on the back of a frigate with warm salty water, doesn't really care. As long as it's not getting sandblasted by the rotor blades, it's going to be reasonably comfortable in that sort of environment. So do we take that into account when we're looking at what spares we need, what maintenance we're going to carry out, the frequency of maintenance, how often we do on-condition maintenance? And the answer is not really. We add some extra tasks sometimes, depending what environment we're in. If we're in a freezing environment, we'll have extra tasks. If we're in a really hot environment, we might add some extra tasks. But we don't really change the frequency of tasks and so on. We don't think about the resources required, the extra resources that might be required to do that, which is kind of insane, really, when you think about it. Because operating in the north, when I was with 3 Commando, we used to go and invade Norway every year and stop the Russians from coming in through Finland and across the top at North Cape there. That's a completely different environment and requires different sort of maintenance than operating in the desert conditions.
Sure, absolutely.
So, again, this is about going to the end point. We've got to fight a war in the desert, or maybe in the Arctic. So are we prepared for both those contingencies?
Yeah. So I guess really that's what you're all about. You're helping people understand those processes. You train people. You consult for people. You let them know how to make all of that happen. And part of TDW Live is that we're parting. Both you and I part with some of our knowledge and our know-how. Mm-hmm. So I asked you. And we'll, over the next few weeks, we'll publish more about what it is we're actually going to talk about at TDW Live. I know that we've got some invites out to some speakers and all those kind of things. So I guess I asked you to jot down some topics for discussion for this podcast around support engineering. And you wrote quite an interesting piece that I've been reading through, and a lot of it is obviously a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge. But the first interesting point you put down was the fear of innovation and lack of development. What do you mean by the fear of innovation? Because if we look at from the Tech Pub's perspective, I'm getting more and more involved now with people talking about how they can take their technical information to the next level. They see the value in the information. In fact, over the years, we've seen a market trend of where Tech Pubs has been an afterthought. Tech Pubs has been something that we will do it, and we'll do it quickly, we'll do it dirty. But what I'm seeing now, more in the commercial sector, is how people are actually seeing the value in their content, and but not seeing the value in the content as a traditional, here's a maintenance manual, but how that information is being used, where it's being used, by the type of people it's being used by, how it's being accessed, how often it's being accessed. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about at TDW Live this year, is beyond the actual technical manual, and what is it that we can actually get beyond just enabling somebody to do a maintenance task. So part of that is obviously how do we adopt innovative ways of creation, deployment, analysis, and so that's one of the things that I'm going to look at. But I'd be interested to hear your perspective on fear of innovation and lack of development, because you mentioned a couple of things in here which made me laugh, because you're talking about stuff that's actually not innovative anymore. It's been around for a very long time. Absolutely. And maybe give me your thoughts on some of that.
No, I think it is. It's a huge problem, and very frustrating, of course, if you're a bit of a techno geek, which I think I am, but Mike's even more so. But take the tech docs one for a start. You said most of this is going in the commercial world. Augmented reality, it's still maturing.
Absolutely it is, but people are taking it seriously now.
But how many serious applications or attempts at applications have you seen actually on a piece of defence equipment for augmented reality? I'll bow to your great judgment, but I suspect not that many. Even you say some of the technology which is actually now quite robust, it's not innovative anymore. So putting manipulatable 3D images into tech pubs is one I've banged on about with your seminars in the past. People have been doing this for years now. It's perfectly possible to do that. It's dead easy. It's really only just starting to happen now in the defence sector, which is kind of crazy because it's been easy to do for a long time. So you find this sort of reluctance to move quickly. We talk about Internet of Things. There's huge potential with the Internet of Things now. So one of the things you were laughing at was was RFIDs.
Sure.
How much are RFIDs, radio frequency identification devices, used in the defence sector? And the answer is not a lot. And they've got huge potential. And you've got this fear. You hear stories. You hear people saying, "Look, I've heard this. You can't use RFIDs near aircraft because you've got this RF thing which transmits RF, and it could be dangerous because you've got weapons on the aircraft." Of course, my response to that is, well, if you can set off the weapons on an aircraft by using an RF scanner, you're buggered.
I'll text the aircraft and set it off myself.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, the Russians would jump up and down with glee, wouldn't they? Because all they've got to do is give you a quick scan or something.
So I guess that's where your fear things comes from, is because in the nicest possible way, and with the utmost respect, and I'm one of these guys, is that technical publications is a second career for a lot of people, and they know what they like and they like what they know, and they've done things in a certain way for a very long time, and there's this perception in some areas that tech pubs is not important. I was with a major aerospace client this week, and we were talking about the process of producing good quality technical publications. And one of the managers in the room actually said, "Oh, so it's much more than just a simple PDF then," and it is absolutely way more than a simple PDF. So I guess that's where a lot of the fear comes from around this stuff, lack of understanding.
I think it's that fear, lack of innovation, and lack of understanding. They're all tied together, I think, in part. The fear comes from a lack of understanding. People don't want to do things they don't understand. I mean, the importance of tech docs. I mean, it's mind-boggling, really, that in this day and age, people can say they don't understand the importance of tech docs. Now, quite a few years ago, I'm thinking how long ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I went to see the REME chief aircraft engineer and the REME chief engineer down at, well, they're still at Harbourfield, so I don't know how long ago that was. And they said at the time that every single safety incident and the reporting to every single safety incident they'd had in the next number of years referenced tech pubs as a causal factor.
Yeah.
So first of all, safety implications are blindingly obvious. The other one is as you've seen, you've got figures and I've seen figures where really good tech pubs have reduced maintenance times by 30, 40, 50%.
Absolutely.
And you just look at that and you go, well, just think of the cost of the maintenance you've just saved. But even bigger than that, if we're in our business, the availability of an asset. Mm-hmm. Let's take the extreme, an F-35. Let's go for the.
Well, and that's been in the news a lot, really, recently about supportability and some of the problems it's had.
Huge number of problems. So you've improved the maintenance on that, and you can get a few percentage points of availability. What's the interest rate on 100 million quid for an hour?
Probably more than I can afford.
It's a lot of money, and that's essentially the way you've got to look at it. If that aircraft is required, and you can't use it because you're maintaining it, or you wait for a spare or whatever, but we're talking about maintenance time at the minute, then that's insane. How much can you afford to invest to actually get the damn thing in the air? If you can reduce maintenance time on 10% of the task by 50%, what's that worth? And the answer is vast sums of money. So to people to not to understand the importance of tech pubs is just barking.
Yeah, and I certainly in the commercial sector now, I'm seeing a huge shift towards, hang on a minute, this is actually valuable information. And like I say, deeper than the tech pub itself. So I without giving too much away what I want to talk about at TDW Live this year, there's a major publishing outlet that gave a really interesting interview on the TV on Sky News. I think it was last week or the week before, and they were talking about where their revenues are coming from. And they're a huge publisher, and they publish all sorts of content. But 8% of their revenue only comes from printed output.
Yeah.
The remainder is digital assets, but analytics of that digital accessing of content.
Yeah.
And that's where the remainder of their revenues is coming from. So if we're not exploiting that with our tech pubs and with our technical information, I think we're doing ourselves a massive disservice.
Yeah.
But tech pubs, I get excited about tech pubs. People laugh at me because I get excited about it, but I get excited about the process of tech pubs. What is it we can actually achieve with this? Most people can write a good instruction and get somebody to do something, but the processes behind it, the tools that we use behind it, what can we achieve from all of analysing who's doing these processes. which is far more interesting and far more engaging. So I think you're right in terms of fear. Fear is a big one. You know, it's a. I've been lucky enough over the last few months to support some pretty major organisations, and because they're a big organisation, I'll mention them, and that's NATO. They are looking at how they can leverage these clever ways of doing things with content.
Yep.
And and then I look at other organisations where they're just happy with the way things are. They're quite happy with their Word files converted to PDF. And there you go, engineer, go do your worst. But we can give things in a much more efficient way.
But there is, as you say, there's value you can leverage out of this. I mean, again, one of the things I've banged on about quite a lot is, when's a tech pub not a tech pub? Same argument you're making. I think it can become a training game. Especially with modern electronic publications, and you embed video and audio and interactivity and all this sort of stuff. All of a sudden, you've transformed it. And this has a knock-on effect then. We've got, if you can start to enable the technicians in the military to do things that they presently they're not allowed to do, to do that safely and competently, then you get a second effect, which is they stop leaving the services. We've got a huge problem with recruitment and retention at the moment in the technical trades.
Well, I think to underpin what you just said there, I am on social media, I'm on Facebook, and I follow a lot of REMI forums.
Yeah.
And we won't name the company name, but a very large UK defence contractor had they were recruiting for a vehicle mechanic, sort of level 2, level 3 kind of vehicle mechanic. So not somebody terribly senior, and they were willing to pay £55,000 a year for a guy. And this young guy chirped up and said, "Hang on a minute. So I'm a corporal in the British Army doing exactly the same job, being paid half what they're willing to pay me in so skills retention is a problem because of those kind of challenges that we have. And I know that they've just had a massive pay rise, and but I don't think it's as big as almost 50% more than what they could earn in Civvy Street. But so you're right, retention's a problem. It's a huge problem.
But it's not just about the wages. I mean, it's a factor, obviously. You can't pay people half for going rate in Civvy Street and expect to get a good result and to retain people. But it's also about job satisfaction. Yeah. I talked to a guy who just left the Navy, and he'd been a chief engineer. I don't know what the proper term is, but on a Type 45. And he said part of the problem is the guys have got the same messing about as we used to have in my day. He says, but they don't go anywhere very exciting very often nowadays. And they're not really allowed to fix anything, so it feels worse because they're not getting the job satisfaction. So basically, they're getting all the downsides of being in the military, and of course there are downsides, but without many of the upsides. And the frustration is driving them to the point where they're just leaving. So they're having a huge problem retaining people. So actually treating the people well, accepting the fact they're perfectly capable of fixing this kit and letting them fix it, is not only good for retention. If you're stuffed on in the South Atlantic somewhere, a long way from any lines of communication, any lines of supply, you need guys on board the ship who can fix stuff. You don't want to be calling in a contractor or having to sail back to the nearest port so you can get your engine fixed and so on and so forth. You need guys there who can do it. And the only way you're going to get that, they need the skills, but also you need the right cultural thing as well. You need that culture that says they're allowed to do this. And they're expected to do this. They're expected to find out how to do things, and they're expected to perhaps try and do a task they've never done before, because it needs to be done. And again, the tech docs, electronic tech docs, and electronic training capabilities all tie into that. Because if you give them that support, they're more likely to be able to do that and to be able to do it effectively. But again, I go with you with tech docs. I mean, there's huge potential, but it's moved incredibly slowly. I remember when I still worked for BS Systems, we went out to Linköping in Sweden and looked at some stuff Saab were doing. It was light years. It was ahead of some of the stuff I see today, and that was 20 odd. Well, it was 1991, 92, something like that.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough this week to be introduced to a couple of major players in the commercial air sector, and they showed me some of the systems that they're using in terms of deploying content to their customers, their MROs, or to the airlines, or anything along those lines. And it's stuff that was being talked about 5-10 years ago. They're actually doing now. They're actually deploying it, and they're actually able to control who has access to their information, and they can block people. But I mean, one of the things I said is, look, if somebody's going to steal your data, they're going to steal your data. We before we turned the cameras on, we were talking about how often our networks are being hit by say not so friendly people who want to try and break in, but they're taking all of the they're using technology that's available now in a technical publications environment to protect their intellectual property, which is something that is huge in the commercial sector. So you talk a little bit about lack of understanding, lack of knowledge. Are you talking about ILS processes, or are you talking about engineering capability in general, or are you talking about a gambit of things?
Well, a whole lot. I mean, the ILS process, I think one of my biggest hobby horses is that people say they're doing ILS, and they're not. They're doing tech docs, they're doing spares provisioning and optimization, they're doing training, but they're doing them all disparately, they're all done separately, and that's not ILS. And my argument to people, I said, just doing that stuff is not ILS. We did that in the Second World War. For God's sake, Alexander the Great did that. He was a great logistician. You can't get from Macedonia to India marching your armies unless you're really good at logistics. But they weren't doing ILS. ILS is something different. It's this integration of this which gives you this optimization, and we need that because we're dealing with really complex bits of kit today. So the first problem is people have forgotten what ILS is. And of course ILS has got a bad reputation over the years for badly implemented programs, and that's part of it as well. ILS is rubbish. Can't do that, can't afford that. People talk about it being a spend to save. My argument is, if it's spend to save, you're doing it wrong. It should be save to save, because improved process gives you an improved product. Improved process also reduces cost. So part of it is that ILS. People don't understand ILS anymore. It's kind of got lost. But not only ILS, RCM. We've seen people talking about RCM. People in positions of power, they think RCM, reliable centre maintenance, is about making things more reliable. It isn't. It's about maintenance. And that lack of people who've read the title and not much more, and then interpolated and basically come to a conclusion about what it is, and they haven't read the standards, they haven't read the textbooks, and so on. So there's a lot of ignorance like that. There's a lot of basic engineering ignorance as well. Quite. I mean, frightening is the right word. It's quite frightening ignorance. I've talked to you. Saw some of the examples I wrote down in my paper. I was brain dumping this the other day. You talk to a reliability engineer who doesn't know what constant failure rate is, or what constant E is, the exponential distribution. They don't know what it is. They don't know what you're talking about. You talk to an RCM person who doesn't understand what the PF interval is. Now again, if you're not an RCM person, you won't know what I'm talking about. But if you're an RCM person and you don't know what the PF interval is, well, you're not an RCM person, quite simply. There's a lot of this really basic ignorance. I talked to a guy who'd been doing ILS for 3 years. On a major project, who'd never heard of, not read, never heard of the DEF Standard 0s or 60, 600 series standards. Now, they're not the most exciting read in the world, like the S1000D standards and stuff like that. But if you're in the business, best you read them, best you know what's in them.
Absolutely.
Because even if you think it's rubbish, you still need to know what's in it, so you can tell it's rubbish. You can't disagree with these things unless you've read them. So there are people with this quite startling lack of understanding. I say, and really quite frightening because of what that can lead to. I talk about failure modes effects and criticality analysis for MECAs and so on, and I also talk about DMEA, damage modes effects analysis. Most people haven't a clue what I'm talking about. Again, kind of frightening given the business we're in. You think you do damage modes effects analysis because, hey, our kit's going to get damaged. So there is a disturbing lack of understanding, and in the world of tech docs, XML, I think there's an astonishing lack of understanding of XML.
I mean, I concur with that, because obviously a great deal of my time is going around educating people on how to use things like S1000D, DITA, iSpecs, anything along those lines. Before I get anywhere near those specifications or standards, I say, well, let's talk about XML, and let's talk about how those standards, those specifications, are leveraging XML. It's not the other way round.
Thank you.
So I spend a great deal of time saying, look, this is where it came from. Structured languages in XML, well, not XML, but structured languages in SGML. 60s they were talking about this capability before I was born. And and we talk a little bit about the history of where it came from and why it came from and why it's such an important methodology of creating and distributing information.
Yeah.
And then what role the standards and specifications then play in tailoring it for a specific environment. But I noticed that here you say, because XML is a big hobby horse of mine, I like to explain to people what they get from using XML.
Yeah.
And if I say your motivation is to use S1000D to create these wonderful XML data modules to publish PDF, your motivations are generally wrong. And
it's doing things the really hard way, isn't it?
you are asking somebody to build you a ship because you want to cross a canal. It's just you're doing it absolutely wrong. If that analogy worked, I'm not sure. But I notice here you're saying, what can you do about it? You're saying new, better standards, and better information and wider education. Now I get that, but I was involved in a conversation recently where somebody said to me, the problem with standards is there's too many to choose from. And we've talked in the past, you and I, about there needs to be a new, clear, concise standard, both in tech docs and because S1000D has its problems. And you know your standards and specifications way better than I do. And and I'm often asked, what's the alternative? What's the alternative, Mike? What's the better way of doing things? Because without turning this into a Tech Pubs podcast particularly, I talk about the information supply chain and how the information supply chain struggles maintaining things like S1000D and why it's a problem for them. And when you talk to the major players, they go, we didn't actually realise that this was the problem it was causing for these guys. And because they normally have a very blinkered view on their project-driven world, and so. But we won't. But I find it interesting. You're saying new, better standards. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think again, the minute a standard gets to a certain size, it ceases to become effective. For a start, so when you're implying a standard, you can't control the world. For a start, you can't micromanage. Standards should be fairly high level and as generic as you could possibly make them. So as detailed as they need to be, and no more, is probably the simple way to put it. Or as complex as they need to be, but no more complex. And otherwise, you're just going to lock yourself into old technology and so on, and old ways of doing things, because people will change. So the standards need to be fairly high level. That's why I bang on all the time about systems and systems engineering. So we need to take a systems approach. So it's a bit like you give a really good example there. People do 1000D, produce all these wonderful XML data modules, and then they publish a PDF document. And you go, well, what was the point of that? Because there's a lot faster ways of getting from there to PDF, without going around these hugely complicated.
Unless you're actually really leveraging the XML in some clever way in the back end, then if you're just producing PDF, there's more efficient ways.
There are lots of more efficient ways of doing it, and you can shortcut that. So basically, I think the standards need to focus on what you're trying to achieve, and some basic principles of how you're going to achieve it. So using effective methods of getting from A to B in the straightest possible way. Going back to the really, really old stuff, remember CALs?
I talk about the CALs and the CALs tables
CALs,
on my
create data vaults, use it many times. That's still it's an old mantra, but it's amazing how often we fail to do that. So you can use XML. If you're doing stuff like we tend to do in the world of logistics, you use databases because we've got so much data, tons of data. We use a form of database. It doesn't always look like a database, but it's a database. So I'm sure. I'm not familiar with some of the technical stuff like Adobe FrameMaker, but I'm pretty damn sure if I lifted this cover of Adobe, I'd find a database underneath it.
In our market now, there are. One of the things I'll talk about at TDW Live this year is some of the COTS tools that are available to make life easier for us in tech docs.
And again, if once you get to that basic principles, you go, right, this is the world as I see it. If it's in a database, I can turn it into XML. No ifs, buts or maybes about it. If I can turn it into XML, I can transform it into almost anything you want. You can have a PDF, you can have an HTML5, you can have it in Kindle, you can have it in Mobi, you can have anything you damn well want. Pardon my French. But you can, and that's the real power of XML. If the information's in there, and it's got some sort of logical structure to it, and I'm not talking about DTDs and things like that. I'm talking about
something you can hook into.
Something logical. If you've got a failure mode, it's got to be against a thing So, you know, you've got to have the thing, you know, the failure mode's got to be related to a thing. If you've got a task related to a failure mode, then, you know, there's a logic to that. There's a logical structure. And if you're following that common sense engineering logic, then you can almost certainly produce the output in any shape or form you want, because you can transform it, you can do clever stuff with it. Now, Aspire is not experts in IT and XML and all that stuff. We do it because we had to do it as an aside. So to make things happen. So, you know, if you do that, then you streamline the process, and that's really where the standards should be. They shouldn't be going into massive amounts of detail. You know, for example, picking on 1000D as I tend to do occasionally, defining what tags are used. I would say, well, if you define what a tag has got to be in XML, have you just stopped it being XML?
And I think S1000D does have its challenges, and I spend a great deal of time explaining I understand where they're coming from with the S1000D spec, and you know, it does get a bad press in a lot of areas, but I think as well is you have to understand what's going on behind the process of those particular tags as well. Which recently I delivered an S1000D authoring course for a major client as well, and I'm surprised how many authors don't actually know. They know what the tag is, but they don't know what's going on behind the tag, i.e. what's going on, what's the thought processes behind the tag, why is it done in such a way.
That's the important bit.
And that comes round to your lack of understanding and lack of knowledge about, you know, supportability engineering. It's the same with writing a good, you know, well-structured piece of information. You need to know why you're using a certain element, why you're using a certain attribute, and what makes it important. And
that's a good point, actually. If you talk about standards, that's possibly a good way of verbalising what I've got in my mind. What makes a good standard? It tells you what to do, why you should be doing it, and somewhat less of the how.
Yeah.
You know, because that's going to change as technology changes in a lot of fields. And different organisations are going to want to do it slightly different ways.
Yeah.
So the XML isn't the only thing you can use. Of course, there are other things, or things you use with XML and so on, which are popping up all over the place now. And XML is has been evolving fairly rapidly for about 10 years at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk about this on my courses, is that where it's going and why it's going in a certain way, and how it's going to affect how we're producing content today, but how we're deploying it as well today. Yeah. Are we going to need these complex viewers in the future? Are we going to need these expensive tools? The biggest complaint in the S1000D market is the expense of software. Yeah. And that's a reality, you know, because it's a niche market, and niche markets drives a higher price and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But when we actually take an XML structure, we pull it apart and we say, look, I deliberately put something that looks very ugly on the screen, and in general I get a load of oh my gods, what is that going to be? You know, that means nothing to me. And I'm going, no, it does. Let's break it down. Yeah. And so we break it down piece by piece. And at the end of the course, I've never had anybody who doesn't look at a piece of XML and go, that's what it's doing. I see what it's doing, and I know how it's working.
It's one of those things which is eminently logical once you get your head around it. You know, I mean, that's the key. But again, you know, there is an argument, and I'll play devil's advocate here, and that is, if you're a tech author, you shouldn't see XML.
But you get those authors that absolutely believe that they want to work in XML, which is fine. So, you know, I have no problem with the guys that want to do that. And you know, you get those that just want to work in a Word kind of environment, which is, you know, it's horses for courses, I think.
It is, and again, what you do is I think I'm not going to have a go at the guys who want to work in XML, because what it means is, if nothing else, is they've learned.
Yeah.
To do that, you've had to learn and understand, and you've got that profound understanding. But generally, you know, if you're a tech author, you should be concentrating on writing stuff and understanding how to do things.
We should be.
The technical bit is a necessary.
So actually, we can go full circle here on the discussion that we've had outside of this podcast, but how you've also talked in this podcast about, are we forgetting about the end user? Are we forgetting about what the end user actually wants? And I go into organisations and I see they're so focused, like a laser, on following the S1000D specification and getting absolutely everything right. And there are reasons why we need to get it right, and there's reasons why, but they're doing it at the detriment of the actual content, of actually giving the user what they need.
Yeah.
The biggest complaint I hear about something like S1000D, and we talk about S1000D because it's the player in the it's the game in town at the moment.
Yeah.
Everyone's talking about it, and they say, well, I can create modules, but why am I deploying modules? You know, I can create these wonderful data modules, but surely I can make something that's a bit more user-friendly and a bit more useful,
Yes.
rather than sending somebody down a paper chain of getting to module, and then I'm lost. I don't know where I am.
Yeah.
And of course, the answer is yes. That's just a bad implementation of publishing the content.
Yeah.
So what do you think in terms of, I just want to come back to this point of better standards. I know we've talked about it in the past about writing our own standards and coming up with a better standard. And I still believe that there are better ways of doing things. Have you thought about writing your own supportability engineering standard? Or?
Well, yes, I have, and I've actually sort of started, but I'm doing it at the margin. So what I've been doing is I'm a sort of a fan of the ISO 15288 systems engineering.
You talked
standard.
about that at the conference last year.
It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's probably the best there is out there. It's a good framework. And the Americans have taken it, and there's a procurement version that you can buy. I haven't bought it and read it yet. I will do. And I believe the Canadians are doing the same thing. So they base their procurement processes on 15288.
Okay.
It's got the same problems as us. I mean, it says, there's if you want to understand configuration, read this standard, and if you want to understand something else, read this standard, and you end up with a list of about 15 other standards you've got to go and buy at 100 quid a pop and read, and they're not like reading. So it does have some issues, but it does provide a good robust structure. So what I've started doing is it's all broken down. I can remember now it's basically broken down into processes and then tasks and so on. And I've been going through it, basically going, right, so what does that mean in the world of support engineering? And I think I've got three tasks or three processes to finish off, which I've been finishing off for about 2 months now, to be honest.
Right, okay.
But that's the idea. The next idea then is to put that against a sort of generic life cycle. So, it's the category cycle, but genericized concept, system level development, detailed development, and so on, and actually put it in as a process flowchart. Because I think that's the way to go. And then stealing things from all the existing standards, which are good ideas. So there's a lot of good stuff in the old LSA standards and the things which have superseded them. So those of you who understand LSA and Mechanised Mill Standard 1388 1A, the original LSA process standard, the Society of Automotive Engineers, the SAE, have got a standard, I can't remember the number of it now, which is basically that with a few extra bits put on. But it's recognisably the sum of that standard, and it's got some good stuff in it. So the idea is you go, right, what's good, keep that, what's bad, throw that out, and get some sort of logical structure there that looks at the life cycle and how things are applied in the life cycle. So that's what I'm doing, partly because I think it'll make it easier to train people as well, because it'll give a good framework for training and a good framework for people to get their head around this and understand what it's all about. And it does tend to focus, as I like, on the end game. What is the point of this? Where are you going? It's all driven by
Is the point to make wonderful XML structures in accordance with a standard or a specification, or is the point that we are trying to make coherent information that we can deliver to an end user or a series of end users?
It's the guy in the defence world, it's the guy in the green or the blue baggy suit at the end of the day who's got something in his hand, be it a piece of paper or a tablet or a mobile phone or a laptop or something, who's got to take that information and do something meaningful with it. And that's their entire focal point. Now remember, we've had this conversation a while ago, but about 5 years ago, I stood up in one of your seminars and said, do you realise that every single presentation on this seminar, apart from one, and that was about simplified English, has been about data manipulation. Not a single person talked about content. Not a single person talked about the end user.
One of the things I like to give myself credit for, and some people say it might be a little bit arrogant, I try not to be, is that after I left my employed career to focus on TDW, I started this messaging of the end user. Don't forget you and I have been there. We've been the guys on the back of these helicopters at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to change an engine. It's chucking it down with rain, and the pilot needs the aircraft to go in a few hours. So, and I started the messaging, what about the end user? What about the end user? And then I noticed all over a sudden all these other consultants started talking about What about the end user? What about the end user? So I don't care particularly that they're doing that. I just think it's important that we do talk about the end user and we talk about where this content is going and how it's being used.
Without that, you've lost the context. All that other stuff's very important. It's all going to be discussed, it's all going to be addressed, but without the context of it's all about the end user, you're likely to go off in the wrong direction. So you're back to your let's produce a data module and then then use it to make a PDF document. I'm sure there's an analogy. There's one perking that will pop out in a minute in the back of my head, but it is a bit like using a computer to chop down a tree type thing. It's a really bad analogy, but
I can normally come up with ones on the fly, good analogies, but it's like putting a nice painting on the wall and turning the painting round towards the wall. It's that kind of that.
But it's plywood on the back.
But I think that without doing, we've got to be balanced here, and the balance is that we talk about on my training courses the problems that S1000D is trying to solve, and what the problems that XML is trying to solve, and how it's solving it, and then it's up to the organisations after that to decide whether it's the solution to their problems.
The first thing is to understand. The first step is to understand. A 1000D, as everyone who's heard me speak knows, I'm not a great fan. Doesn't mean there's not some really sound principles in there, and certainly XML is. I'm a great fan of XML because of the power, the things it enables you to do is just tremendous. But the trick is again with all of these things, you've got to look at them really quite hard. First of all, you've got to ask yourself the question: why did people do this? Mm-hmm. What drove them to this? Now, sometimes it's a what you might call a genuine reason. They were trying to solve a real problem for the end user, or ultimately for the end user. Sometimes it's something a lot worse. It's politics. It's a small political.
Well, I mean, S1000D was solving the real problem of multinational projects, trying to integrate data from multiple suppliers and having a coherent way of delivering and integrating that content. Which was whoever came up with the idea. All kudos. I think it's a great idea, and they did very, very well. There are things that they got wrong in the specification and are still in the specification that need to be ironed out and looked at. If you compare it, I mean, we're turning it again into a discussion about S1000D, but if you compare it to other similar approaches like DITA, what has DITA got so right that it makes it so much easier to adopt and it makes it so much easier to use and deploy? But I guess because we're almost at the hour, and I want to try and keep it to an hour if we can. So where do you think we're going wrong, and what can we do in the support information? I know you wrote a great big piece on that, but maybe synopsise that for us. Because I want to come to you quoted some things to me about Penny Mordaunt, and I want to and for those of you who don't know who Penny is or was, she was our Defence Secretary in the UK a little while back. A little while back, it was about 2 weeks ago. I think she was let go.
Yeah, she wasn't. She wasn't there for very long, but
no,
she was.
But I know that
making the right noises.
I don't know whether you want to do Penny's quotes first, or do you want to talk about where we're going wrong with
I'll just make some points. I mean, I think the reason I put Penny's points in there was we're not doing this particularly well. ILS, support engineering, whatever you call it, it's not working very well. We're not getting good results, And she just, in her maiden speech as Defence Secretary, first speech as Defence Secretary, I'll read. She said, there's some common stuff here. What's the point of methodically reviewing threats and tasks, formulating capability, then not delivering it? What's the point of building ships onto mothball then because we've got a lack of crew or a lack of spares or funds? Well, some of that falls into the sphere of support engineering. One of the things you should be doing, of course, and this falls into the ISO thing again, the ISO 15288, is what are the constraints you're operating under? There's no point designing a ship you can't man unless you've got a plan to address the manning issues. Mm-hmm. So you're just solving part of the problem. You've got a two-legged stool. If you haven't got the spares, it happens all the time, again and again and again and again. We just don't buy the right spares because people haven't done the spares analysis, or if they have done the sparing analysis and someone said too expensive, chop out half of that. Well, again, you might as well don't buy so many ships, but buy the spares for the ones you've got, is my answer, because you're just kidding yourself otherwise. So it's an example really of the problems that we've got in the business. And there's the other one about the other point I highlighted here was what's the point of running old vessels and delaying new ones? We're talking about ships, but it applies to airplanes and tanks and stuff as well. Only to run up massive costs in the process. So bite the bullet, save money now. The classic example, Lee, who's sat downstairs here, wrote an article the other day about the nuclear submarines.
Yeah.
We haven't disposed of a single nuclear submarine in the UK ever.
Yeah, we've stockpiled them somewhere.
They're all stockpiled in Portsmouth. I think it's Portsmouth or Devonport.
Devonport, I think, and a couple in Scotland.
And up in Scotland as well. Yeah.
And you can Google Earth that. That's not us releasing secrets.
You can see them. Yes,
you can go to Google Earth and you can see them.
You can actually look at them. Yeah, they're all sat there.
Yeah.
And one of the early submarines is called Dreadnought, which is what the new submarine that they're designing and building at the minute is going to be called. And there's a chance that the old Dreadnought's going to be sat aside, along the new Dreadnought scrapped if we don't get out. And that's costing huge amounts of money. So why don't we bite the bullet? And this is a through life cost type thing, you know. Bite the bullet, get rid of it, save the money, and now start spending the money on stuff we need. Because we do need the money. So that was just making a point that at the high level, there's lots and lots and lots of stories about how things are going wrong. So we can do better. We have to do better. So that's that one. The information one question though, what can we do better on information? We're not really doing information management very well at all. You know, we're still sending on major projects where you're a supplier supplying a prime. You're sending information in spreadsheets and stuff like this, and you go, for heaven's sake, guys, you know, this is really bad. The LSARs people are still buying and using today are based on technology. I'm trying to think when the Mill Standard 1388 2B standard was published. And there are iterations of that. There's an SAE standard which is followed on from it and so on and so forth. But they're pretty much the same. We're talking about really old relational database technology here. And we wouldn't build databases like this today, we wouldn't specify it like it. But we're still using them. And some projects are still using the precursor to that, which is a flat file hierarchical database, which is kind of, imagine a load of spreadsheets. It's kind of terrifying. So, and we haven't really developed very much. There's nothing particularly sophisticated about these support databases. So we haven't moved on. Now, the other day, you know, just to give you an idea of the art of the possible, I had to take on board a new accounting package. Zero for anybody who's interested. It's an online cloud-based accounting package.
I think Claire uses QuickBooks. I think
they're the same sort of thing. Because nowadays, of course, if you put your VAT return in, you've got to do what they call making tax digital. You've got to do it online. You can't send it for you. Can't.
It's all the big thing. It's the latest GDPR, isn't it? Yeah. Everyone was jumping up and down about GDPR, and now it's tax online.
It's tax. So what you do is you basically you do your accounts. It talks to your bank, downloads your statement, and puts it in your accounting package. So there's a link to your bank. And it does that, you just go down. Then you reconcile it all. And when you do your tax, you go submit VAT return to the taxman.
Done.
It's all done. Now, that's 22 quid a month.
And by the way, that'll all be XML going on in the background.
Oh yeah, it is. It's almost certainly. So you look at that and you go, okay, the market for that is massive, you know. But that's the art of the possible today. So why have we got thousands very often of suppliers sending stuff in spreadsheets? So that somebody can then try and consolidate it into something, import it into some bigger database at the prime contractors, for example. It's exactly. Why are we not producing our outputs using XML and XSLT and stuff like that from our core databases? You know, why aren't we producing data modules straight from the analysis? If we're doing maintenance task analysis, why don't we get it to as near as damn camera ready, Mobi ready, Kindle ready, whatever you want to call it, ready outputs straight from our tools, our supportability tools. Because there's no reason why we shouldn't. I know we can do it because we've done it.
And then some people are trying. You know, some people do take the task narratives directly from.
There are people working in that direction.
So there are people that and there are software tools that will support that as well. Allow you to extract information from, like, for example, a 1388. Drag it into an S1000D module environment, and then the challenges around that is that engineers are not often writers, and writers need to come in and tidy up.
Well, there's another hobby horse of mine, and again, it's one of the problems. It goes back to the idea of standards. You know, so a friend of mine once said, if you've got 5 disparate standards and you want to write one coherent standard to replace them, you'll end up with 6 disparate standards.
Exactly.
And that's part of the problem that's going on. What we shouldn't be doing is shifting it from there to process it and so on. We should have one editable version of the truth. The rest of it should be manipulation, as in terms of, you know, the mechanics of things. But basically, you want one editable version of the truth, and that's the only version that should exist. There's no reason why we shouldn't achieve that today. And what part of the problem is you get these parallel paths. So we talked to another very large prime contractor, and they said, well, we want to take RCM data, we want to put it into our LSAR, but we also want to put it into, and they had, I can't remember, there was 2 streams. One was Adobe FrameMaker, I think, and there was something else they were using for tech pubs as well, and they wanted to put different bits, and they wanted to have these 2 streams. So they had RCM into LSAR, RCM data into these two streams of tech pubs, which should then eventually come out, with some sort of result that we're going to deliver to the customer. And you just look at it and go, no, this is not right. This is not the way to do it, guys. But also going back to your point, you said you've got an engineer who's written this task description. Well, why? Why is he doing it? It's not his job. That's the tech author's job.
So, but I think from my experience of working in this area, that those that are using things like 1388 2B, the engineer will write a bit of a, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do that, and then the author will take that and write a nice, pretty data.
Well, what they do is, you're right. So what happens is, what you very often have is this thing they called an LSA engineer. Right? Yeah. In my world, there is no LSA engineer. They don't exist. You might have somebody who understands LSA, an LSA manager, an LSA expert, but you don't have an LSA engineer. The guy who writes the task description, once you somebody identifies the task by doing Formica and RCM, right? So you have some specialists who do that, and then you have a specialist who writes the task analysis, because they're called tech authors as far as I'm concerned, because that's what they do. And if you want someone to look at what spares are required, then you get the provisioning expert in, and they do that. The fact that it's all in one database called an LSAR doesn't matter diddly. You should have the experts doing it. That was the idea behind LSA in the past. It's not that you have this, it's an extra thing. And typically, of course, what you find is those LSA engineers, they don't write just a very thin document. They write quite a detailed document when they're doing task analysis, which they then, with all the errors and all the rest of it, pass over to the tech authors, who then take it away into another package and manipulate it and fix it. They don't fix it in the LSAR. They take it out and do something else with it. So now you've got two versions of this.
Yeah, you've got the raw straight from the engineer's mind into the database, and then you've got the pristine inner CSDB, as we call it, in the S1000D environment.
Now, some people will feed that back in,
and some people do try to connect the two environments as well. So if something changes over here, it'll say in here you need to go change it.
But it doesn't. But not always the case. So some people obviously are doing the right thing, but a lot of people aren't. So you end up with this disparate. You end up with these different versions of the truth all over the place. And of course, as soon as you've got that, you've got configuration control problems. You're going to end up with diversions between different versions, and so on and so forth. So, because the guy who takes the tech author, let's just take the worst case, take it out, manipulates it, makes it into proper tech authoring language, and so it's suitable for, and that goes off and does something. But the guy's still using the LSAR now, and he's doing identifying spares and tools and test equipment and all the rest of it on that. Now, if something's changed in that tech authored version because he's spotted some errors and he's corrected it, and he's maybe gone and looked at the actual bit of kit, he's looked at somebody actually doing a maintenance task and he's changed it. Mm-hmm. Well, unless that goes back into the original, the LSAR source, you've got a problem. You're in divergence. And this is the sort of thing you go, well, this happens. There's no ifs, buts, and babies about it. That happens.
It's the reality of the world.
But why is the question? The thing I can't understand is with the modern technology we've got today, and it's relative. I stress the word relative now. It's relatively easy to create quite a sophisticated database-based tool set nowadays with modern tools and technology. You still need some bright guys who can do coding and all that sort of stuff, but we don't seem to be doing that. We're making it really, really quite hard. Mm-hmm. So we should have been able to produce a really slick support working environment now that everyone could dip into and streamline this process. And that's the information bit that underpins it all. And I think very often, understanding that information piece also makes you start to understand where there are discrepancies or duplicated effort in different disciplines. Again, going back to the tech docs and training, because it's an easy one to pick on.
Sure.
You look at it; it's the same information. Training is to make a maintainer able to do his job. Tech pubs is to make a maintainer able to do his job. Leaving aside the extra bits you talked about. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing. So there should be a lot of it should be core. I'm not saying all of it, because there will be differences, but a lot of it should be core. And it's not. We end up with divergence, and of course you end up then with training doesn't match the tech pubs and so on and so forth. And it costs you more. It costs you more to do it badly than to do it properly. So I struggle with now why we don't have better information systems in this day and age.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there is, in my personal view, there's room for some innovation in this market. When I see all the disparate systems and I see how they all work, I believe that there is room for some innovation. I'll be going to the S1000D user forum later on this year in in London. They're holding it in London this year, and I'll be going along. And the first thing I'll be looking for is which companies are actually trying to push the envelope in this market and not just doing the same old. Who are the guys that are actually doing something a little bit more interesting for us in terms of how can we really enable our end users and our
Well, I think
content.
part of that is people, again, there's this education bit, but this education and understanding. I was training a fairly large middle tier sort of defence contractor, so not on BA systems, but the sort of next level down in Europe. And as part of it, they said, well, we haven't got a logistics database, we haven't got an LSAR. Should we buy one? I said, no, make one. Build it yourself. Their immediate response was, we're not big enough.
I hear that a lot around LSA. I hear that a lot of people will go, we're not big enough, we can't afford that kind of infrastructure, we can't afford that process, we can't afford that investment in that stuff. So
that's a misperception.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe a topic for another podcast. We could certainly talk about that. We have certainly gone an hour and 10 minutes here, which I think is... I know you and I can talk for hours and hours on these subjects, and we have done in the past.
Yeah, but their tolerance isn't an hour.
Maybe their tolerance isn't as much as ours. But, Peter, thank you very much. How do people get hold of you? You're on LinkedIn?
I'm on LinkedIn. They can find our website.
aspirecl.co.uk. and
.co.uk, that's right,
yeah, and I'll put it all in the show notes. So if anybody wants to connect with Peter direct, we would like to know your thoughts on this podcast. And do challenge us what we're saying, and we'd be more than happy to debate and discuss. Tell us what your challenges are around things like using any of these standards or specifications that we've mentioned today. And I hope you found this podcast useful and interesting. It just leads me to say to Peter, again, thank you very much. I think it went much smoother than what we originally anticipated, because we actually we got into our rhythm very, very quickly, which is it kind of exemplifies that we've done this a few times in the past, chewing the cud here about these standards and specifications. So if you want to meet Peter in person, do please come along to TDW Live this year, where Peter will be doing some of this stuff in much more detail at the conference. And he always likes a nice drink, so you'll be able to buy him a drink, and he'll help you get on the right track with this stuff. So until the next podcast, again, Peter, thank you very much. Do you want to say goodbye to everybody? We'll do the next one.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate one thing, and that is, if you don't agree, by all means don't agree, argue. We don't have enough discussion in this business. Come back and tell me I'm talking nonsense.
Rubbish.
But thanks anyway. Thanks all.
Brilliant. Cheers, guys, and until the next one.
Thank you for listening to the TDW podcast. Remember, you can keep your tech data skills current and relevant with a full TDIQ subscription. Visit www.techdataworld.com for more details. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube for your next Tech Data World update. Until next time.